It's said the Texans are prideful. They'll certainly tell you about how much they love their Whataburger, Bluebell ice cream, and how clean their mega gas station, Bucky's bathrooms are. You might also call them friendly, seeing as how their motto is friendship, after all, and not don't mess with Texas, like people so commonly mistake. Before we begin, it's important to give a brief explanation of Texas' involvement with the Civil War. Texas, like all southern states, contained slavery. In fact, the total slave population was at about 182,566 in 1860. The total percentage of population in slavery was at about 30%. While not the largest number, that dishonor actually goes to Virginia and South Carolina, respectively, the number still meant that Texan slave owners had a significant investment in keeping slavery alive in Texas. When Abraham Lincoln, the tallest and most handsome president to ever serve in office, took over the country in 1860, Texans were up in arms and ready to fight as they thought he would take away their way of life. All except one man, Governor Sam Houston. Sam Houston, the Texas Revolutionary General, congressman, and two-time president of Texas, thought that fighting against such a massive opponent would be futile. He in fact said, and I quote, "Let me tell you what is coming. After the sacrifice of countless millions of treasures and hundreds of thousands of lives, you may win Southern independence, if God be not against you. I tell you that, while I believe with you in the doctrine of state rights, the North is determined to preserve the Union. They are not a fiery, impulsive people as you are, for they live in colder climates. But when they begin to move in a given direction, they move with the steady momentum and perseverance of a mighty avalanche. And what I fear is, they will overwhelm the South." End quote. But Texas Congress didn't quite listen to him, and in February 1st, 1861, after holding a political convention to vote on if Texas should secede, they ousted Houston from office and voted to secede from the Union, becoming the seventh state to secede. Texas, a state deep in the Confederacy, did not see a lot of action, like so many other states in the Confederacy. However, the Union mounted several attempts to capture the trans-Mississippi region of Texas and Louisiana from 1862 until the war's end. With ports to the east captured or under blockade, Texas in particular became a blockade-running haven. Texas's primary contribution to the South was its steady supply of men, horses, food, clothing, and arms. There were a few fights that took place in Texas, however, such as the Battle of Galveston, where Union forces tried to blockade the Texas coast. Union forces, led by Commander William B. Renshaw, led his squadron of 8 ships into Galveston Harbor to demand the surrender of the most important Texas port on October 4th, 1862. Union forces held the harbor until Confederates entered Galveston on New Year's night, January 1st, 1863, and opened fire before dawn. Confederate cottonclads struck from the rear of the Union squadron. The Harriet Lane sank the Neptune when it tried to ram the Union ship, but men from the Bayou City boarded and seized the Federal vessel despite the explosion of their own heavy cannons. Renshaw's flagship, the Westfield, ran aground, and the commander died trying to blow up his ship rather than surrender it. The other Union ships sailed out to sea, ignoring Confederate surrender demands, which could be enforced only upon the abandoned Federal infantry in town. Confederate forces took back Galveston, where they would hold it until the end of the war. The most famous fight, however, would not come until the end of the war, ironically, after the ink had dried and the Civil War was officially over. On May 13th, 1865, more than a month after the surrender of General Robert E. Lee, the last action of the Civil War took place at Palmito Ranch near Brownsville, Texas. Early on in the war, the Union Army had briefly occupied Brownsville, but they were unable to hold the city. They established a base at the Brazos Santiago on Brazos Island, from which they wanted to blockade the Rio Grande and Brownsville. In February 1865, Union Commander Colonel Theodore H. Barrett reported that his base was secure from being attacked. Colonel Barrett asked if he could take Brownsville, for which his superiors denied. Instead, Major General Lewis Wallace sought and received General Ulysses S. Grant's permission to meet the Confederate commanders of the Brownsville area, those being Brigadier General James E. Slaughter, commander of the Western Subdistrict of Texas, and Colonel John Salmon Ford, commander of the Southern Division of Slaughter's command at Port Isabella on March 11, 1865. He hoped to arrange a separate peace in the area. Wallace had promised no retaliation against Confederates so long as they took an oath to the Union, and anyone who preferred to leave the country would be given time to pack up and do so. Slaughter's superior in Houston, however, Major General John G. Walker, denounced Wallace's terms and wrote a stinging letter to Slaughter for having even listened to them in the first place. The commander of the Confederate Trans-Mississippi Department, Lieutenant General Edmund Kirby Smith, was not ready to abandon the cause either. So, on May 9, 1865, he told the governors of the Western Confederate States that despite Lee's surrender, his own army would remain, and he proposed to continue the fight. It's also important to mention that Confederates in Texas weren't unaware of the fate of their comrades in the Eastern Army. On May 1, 1865, a passenger of the steamer heading up the Rio Grande towards Brownsville tossed a copy of the New Orleans Times to some Confederates at Palmito Ranch. The paper contained the news of Lee's surrender, Lincoln's death, and the surrender negotiations between Johnston and Sherman. Many men in the Confederate Army took this opportunity to leave and go home to their families, several hundred doing so. That just meant that the men who stayed were loyal and willing to fight this out to the end. The Union, meanwhile, had received reports that Southerners were prepared to evacuate Brownsville and move east of Corpus Christi. In light of this intelligence, Colonel Barrett ordered 250 men of the 62nd United States Colored Infantry and 50 men of the 2nd Texas United States Cavalry to cross the mainland from Brazos Island at Boca Chica Pass to occupy Brownsville. Carrying 5 days' rations and 100 rounds of ammunition per man, the Union troops crossed over to the coast at 9:30 p.m. on May 11, 1865. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel David Branson, the detachment marched all night and reached White's Ranch at daybreak. There, Branson's men halted and tried to conceal themselves in a thicket along the Rio Grande. The camp was spotted by civilians, probably Confederate soldiers, on the Mexican side of the river. Realizing that any hope of surprising the Confederates were lost, Branson immediately resumed his march towards Brownsville. At Palmito Ranch, the Union encountered Captain W.N. Robinson's 190-man company of Lieutenant Colonel George H. Giddings' Texas Cavalry Battalion, which skirmished briefly with the Union forces before retreating. The Union, too, fell back to a hill overlooking the ranch to rest and recover. Camping for the night, the Union troops remained undisturbed until 3 a.m. when Robinson's company reappeared. Colonel Ford had ordered Robinson to maintain contact with Branson's column and promised to reinforce him as soon as possible. Under pressure from Robinson, the Union retreated back to White's Ranch, where Branson sent a courier to Brazos, Santiago, asking for Colonel Barrett for reinforcements. Barrett himself arrived at 5 a.m. on May 13, 1865, with 200 more men of the 34th Indian Infantry, bringing the Union strength up to a total of 500 officers and men. Under Barrett's command, the column moved on Palmito Ranch once more, and a sharp engagement took place in a thicket along the riverbank between Barrett's 500 troop and Robinson's 190 Confederate soldiers. The outnumbered but persistent Southerners were soon pushed back across the open prairie and beyond sight, while the exhausted Union paused on a small hill about a mile west of Palmito Ranch. At around 3 that afternoon, Colonel Ford had arrived to reinforce Robinson with 300 men from his own 2nd Texas Cavalry. With mounted cavalry and artillery, Ford had the perfect force to deal with Barrett's infantry on the flat, open land around Palmito Ranch. Hidden by a group of small trees, Ford's men formed their own line of battle. At 4 p.m., Jones's gun began to fire. After a brief bombardment, Robinson's men attacked the Union's left near the river, while 2 other companies of Gideon's battalion struck at its right. At the same time, the rest of Ford's men charged the enemy's center. The Southern assault came as a great surprise, and the Union line rapidly fell apart. Barrett later reported that, having no artillery to oppose the enemy's 6 12-pound field pieces, our position became untenable. We therefore fell back fighting. Ford remembered it differently when he wrote his memoirs that Barrett seemed to have lost his presence of mind, and to have led his troops off the field in a rather confusing manner. 46 men of the 34th Indian were put out as skirmishers and left to be captured as the Union fell back towards Brazos Island. Only by deploying 140 of the 62nd Colored in a line running from the Rio Grande to 3/4 of a mile inland did the Union troops slow the Confederate attack enough to allow Northerners to get away. Ford wrote that the battle from its beginning had been a run and demonstrated how fast demoralized men could get overgrounded. The Confederates chased the Union for several miles to Brazos Island. There, they routed Union troops, were met by reinforcements, and Ford's men ceased their attack. Ford said, "Boys, we have done finely. We will let well enough alone and retire." The action had lasted a total of 4 hours. Confederate casualties were a few dozen wounded. The Union lost 111 men and 4 officers captured, and 30 men were wounded or killed. As an ironic twist of fate, at the same time that the Battle of Palmito Ranch was taking place, the Confederate governors of Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, and Texas were authorizing Kirby Smith to disband his armies and end the war. A few days later, Federal officers from Brazos Santiago visited Brownsville to arrange a truce with General Slaughter and Colonel Ford. The Battle of Palmito Ranch marks the final skirmish of the Civil War, and in a lot of ways shows the true Texan spirit of fighting to the very end. However, you do have to wonder, was all the bloodshed necessary? The ink had already dried on documents ending the Civil War. However, because the actions of a few stubborn Texans, the war had gone on to last a little bit longer and officially end in the Lone Star State.